Welcome to 8 Minutes Chinese. Today, we're unlocking the essential phrases you can use in daily life and master in your next business negotiation.
Have you ever noticed that the most successful people, whether they're landing some dream job or, building a billion-dollar company, they almost never get there by moving in a straight line?
Right. Yeah, it's almost never a straight path.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're unpacking this idea because we're constantly conditioned to believe that achievement is a sprint from point A to point B. You pick a goal, you run directly at it, and if you hit a wall or, face a massive public failure, you feel like you've somehow lost the game.
Oh, absolutely. The straight line is, it's often an illusion, and strategically speaking, it's actually a trap.
A trap. Okay, so what is the mission for us today?
Well, our modern obsession with directness totally ignores this 2,500-year-old military philosophy from Sun Tzu's Art of War. I mean, we usually think of Sun Tzu in terms of, troop movements or ancient battlefields.
Right, swords and shields and all that.
Yeah, exactly. But the core psychological mechanics of his strategy have quietly become basically the ultimate playbook for modern business, startup culture, and honestly, just navigating your own career.
Okay, let's unpack this. We're going to anchor this entire discussion on a very specific ancient Chinese idiom from that text. It's a concept that requires a complete rewiring of how we process progress and how we handle catastrophe.
Yeah, it really does.
So let's introduce the phrase. And to really grasp the mechanical weight of the concept, we need to hear the exact tonal structure. Take this as slow as possible, like syllable by syllable.
Okay, yes. The structure of the phrase is essentially two balancing weights representing the two phases of the strategy. Listen closely to the tonal shifts. I'm going to emphasize every single syllable with a micropause. It is iguizi ikunwanveli.
Let me lock that in. I really want to feel the cadence of it. So it's iguizi ua.
You have the exact rhythm. Perfect.
Awesome.
Now let's decode the actual mechanics. The first half, uaz, translates to using the roundabout or the winding path as the direct route.
So intentionally taking what looks like the long way.
Right. You take the long way to arrive at the destination much faster. And the second half, yu huan wei li, means turning adversity, disaster, or like a crippling constraint into your primary advantage.
Wow. So we are literally talking about weaponizing indirectness and then turning an inevitable disaster into your actual win.
That is exactly what we're talking about.
Okay, before we look at the disaster phase, which I'm very curious about, we need to examine why that initial direct route is so dangerous. Because, my default setting is efficiency.
Sure, most people's is.
Right. Like if I want a specific outcome, going straight for it just feels honest. It feels optimal.
It does feel that way. But Sun Tzu is viewing this through the lens of terrain and friction.
What does that mean exactly?
Well, put yourself in the mindset of an ancient general managing finite resources. If you march your army straight across an open plain toward a fortified enemy, your path is blindingly obvious.
Because they can literally see you coming.
Yes, because your intention is perfectly clear, the enemy knows exactly where to allocate their resources. They fortify that specific choke point, they dig trenches, they build walls, they prepare ambushes right where they know you're going to step.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Directness telegraphs your intent, and that predictability breeds massive friction. The harder you push on the direct path, the more resistance the system generates against you.
That makes so much sense. Let's pull that off the ancient battlefield and put it into like an everyday social scenario.
Okay, yeah.
It sounds like trying to get into a wildly popular, highly exclusive nightclub.
Oh, that's a great example.
Right. The direct path is marching straight up to the front door, standing in this massive, stagnant line of hundreds of people, and trying to plead your case to a bouncer whose entire job is to keep you out.
Exactly. That is the straight line. It's highly direct, entirely predictable, and it generates the maximum amount of friction.
So what's the roundabout path in that everyday social setting?
The roundabout path, the Yu Ways approach, is abandoning the front door entirely. You go to the quiet dive bar next door, strike up a conversation with the DJ who happens to be grabbing a drink before their set.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Right. You buy them a drink, you chat, and an hour later you walk through the kitchen door straight into VIP. You completely bypass the fortified choke point.
I love that. So let's shift this to a workplace or business strategy scenario.
Yeah.
How does that translate mechanically to, say, finding a job?
Well, the modern corporate equivalent of that bouncer is the applicant tracking system, the HR algorithm.
Oh, man, the ATS.
Yeah, the dreaded ATS. If you want a job at a top-tier company, the direct path is submitting your resume to the online portal, along with, like, 10,000 other people.
Just standing in the virtual nightclub line.
Exactly. You are marching straight into a system deliberately engineered to filter you out. ATS software strips your formatting, it stands for highly specific keyword combinations, and it basically defaults to rejection. The gatekeepers have heavily fortified the direct route.
So how do you bypass the HR algorithm using the indirect route?
You stop asking for the job, and you start solving the operational bottleneck.
Wait, what do you mean?
So say you find the VP of marketing on a podcast, and they mention a specific supply chain issue or maybe a flaw in their customer retention. You spend a week building a 2-page brief, mapping out a solution to that exact problem, and you send it directly to their inbox.
Oh, wow. So you aren't even in the applicant pool anymore.
Exactly. You are operating on a completely different, unfortified terrain. You spend time building a sideways relationship. Now, that feels slower than just clicking apply, but when the unlisted role opens up, you are already inside the building.
You're walking through the kitchen door.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes perfect sense for an individual trying to navigate a career. But I want to scale this up. How does a massive entity like an entire startup actually execute the indirect path without just, losing focus?
Well, the origin of Instagram is a fascinating case study in this, because their direct path was an absolute failure.
Wait, really? Instagram?
Yeah, Instagram originally launched as an app called Bourbon. It was a location-based check-in app, back in the early 2010s when checking into physical locations was the huge trend.
Oh, right, like Foursquare.
Exactly. The problem was that the terrain was already occupied by heavily entrenched giants like Foursquare and Gowalla. Bourbon was marching their tiny startup directly at competitors with vastly more resources and market share.
So they were standing in that crowded line outside the club, just fighting for scraps of attention.
Right. But instead of continuing to bash their heads against that wall, the founders started actually looking at their user data.
And what did they find?
They noticed that while nobody cared about the check-in feature, users were highly engaged with this very minor, clunky side feature that allowed them to share photos with, rudimentary filters.
Huh. But that wasn't even the point of the app.
It wasn't. It was a complete detour.
So the mechanics of their pivot are what really matters here. Right? They didn't just add better filters and keep fighting Foursquare.
No, they didn't. They executed a textbook Sun Tzu maneuver. They attacked where the enemy was unprepared.
How did they do that?
They ruthlessly burned their own ships. They deleted the check-in model entirely. They stripped away everything except the photos and the filters.
Wow. They just abandoned the whole original idea.
They completely abandoned the fortified location app terrain, and they created an entirely new, uncontested category of visual communication. By stopping their direct assault and going sideways into a minor feature, they bypassed the competition entirely.
And scaled to $1 billion at unprecedented speed. Okay, but Bourbon's pivot was relatively cheap. I mean, they were a small startup, they looked at the data, and they changed the code. I want to push back on the psychological reality of the second half of our idiom.
The ikonweli part.
Yes, the weaponizing disaster part. It is easy to say, turn adversity into an advantage when the stakes are low. But when a massive failure threatens your livelihood or your reputation or your entire identity, the biological response is panic.
Oh, for sure. It's terrifying.
So how do these sources suggest we override the human instinct to view massive failure as just pure trauma?
The key distinction lies in decoupling your ego from the mechanics of the failure. Most people internalize a disaster as a permanent indictment of their competence, like, I failed, therefore I am a failure.
Right, it feels deeply personal.
But strategic operators view a disaster as a highly concentrated, incredibly valuable data drop. A catastrophic failure is just the universe loudly signaling that your underlying assumptions about the terrain were fundamentally incorrect.
So the wreckage itself contains the blueprint for the actual solution. Okay, give me an example, like an individual psychological example of this.
Let's look at the hedge fund manager, Ray Dalio. We are talking about systemizing failure on a multi-billion-dollar scale. In the early 1980s, he didn't just make a minor error. He made a highly arrogant, aggressively public miscalculation about the global economy.
What did he do?
He went on national television and predicted a crippling economic depression.
Oh, wow, on national TV.
Yes, and he bet his entire fund on that prediction. But he was catastrophically wrong. The stock market rallied into a massive bull run instead.
Oh, my God.
Yeah. Dalio lost roughly 70% of his fund's value.
70%.
70%. He had to fire almost his entire staff, and he actually had to borrow money from his family just to pay his personal living expenses.
I mean, in the finance world, that isn't just a setback. That is an extinction-level event.
It really is. The public humiliation alone would drive most people out of the industry forever.
Losing 70% of a fund and begging your dad for rent money is the literal definition of Huon. Deep adversity.
Deep, deep adversity.
The biological response is to hide. So how do you extract an advantage from that level of public devastation?
Well, he weaponized the mechanics of his own arrogance. Dalio realized the disaster wasn't just a bad trade, it was a flaw in his actual decision-making architecture. He was way too confident in his own unverified assumptions.
So what did he do?
Instead of retreating, he obsessively documented the exact cognitive biases that led to the crash. He used that raw, painful data to build an institutional system he called radical truth and radical transparency.
But this isn't just a corporate buzzword, right? The way he actually implemented this in the boardroom at Bridgewater is intense.
Oh, it's wild. He didn't just ask people to be honest. He built algorithmic decision-making systems to override human ego.
How does that work?
He instituted this thing called believability-weighted decision-making. In meetings, every employee continually grades each other's assertions on iPads based on their proven track record in specific areas.
Where they literally grade each other during the meeting.
Yes. The system completely decouples the value of an idea from the hierarchy or the ego of the person presenting it. It is an intricate institutional defense mechanism designed specifically to prevent the exact brand of blind arrogance that caused his collapse in the 80s.
So he took the anatomy of his greatest disaster and engineered it into the foundation of what became the largest hedge fund in the world.
Exactly. The disaster wasn't a detour. It was the required curriculum.
Wow. We actually see that same extraction process in the tech world with the origin of Slack, don't we?
Oh, definitely.
Because Slack is currently the central nervous system for thousands of global corporations, but it was born from the literal ashes of a failed video game.
Yeah, the founders were attempting to build a massively multiplayer online game called Glitch. It was this incredibly ambitious, highly complex Flash-based world that required intense, real-time coordination among a fully distributed team of developers.
And the market completely rejected it, right?
Completely. The game was too niche, the technology was too demanding, and they just ran out of money. Total systemic failure.
But look closely at what happened next. To manage the immense technical complexity of building that doomed game across different time zones, the developers realized that off-the-shelf communication tools were entirely inadequate.
Right, so they basically hacked together their own custom IRC-like internal messaging infrastructure.
And when the game inevitably collapsed, they didn't just pack up their desks. They looked at the wreckage and asked what system actually survived the chaos.
Which was the internal chat tool.
Exactly. The underlying architecture they built to survive their own operational disaster was actually more robust and vastly more valuable than the consumer product they were trying to sell.
They didn't even have to write new code initially. They just stripped the video game user interface off their internal messaging tool, packaged the raw communication architecture, and introduced Slack to the market.
That is the ultimate Iquan Wei Li.
It really is. They didn't pivot away from the disaster. They reached right into the rubble, pulled out the one load-bearing pillar that didn't snap, and used it to build a multi-billion-dollar SaaS empire. The complexity that killed their game was the exact pressure cooker required to forge the communication tool.
Okay, so if we synthesize these two massive concepts, assuming the direct path is a trap, and assuming disasters are merely raw data, it fundamentally alters daily execution.
It changes everything.
But it also sounds dangerously close to just winging it. I mean, what does this all mean for you listening right now? Are we supposed to abandon long-term planning and just wander around waiting for a catastrophe to point us in the right direction?
No. Sense of despised random chaos. What we are discussing is the discipline of strategic wandering.
Strategic wandering. I like that phrase.
When you set a massive objective, you must hold the ultimate destination with an iron grip. But you must hold your initial path very loosely. Statistically speaking, the first route you map out is flawed.
Because things change.
Exactly. Hidden variables will emerge, competitors will blockade the obvious channels, and the terrain will shift.
So you optimize for learning and course correction rather than blind, rigid execution. You don't just put your head down and accelerate into a brick wall just because the wall happens to be on your straight line.
Right. You stop, you probe the perimeter, and you look for the kitchen door.
That's brilliant. Is there a recent example of this strategic wandering at scale?
The most profound recent example on a global scale was the pandemic's impact on corporate infrastructure. Think back to early 2020. Every traditional business hit the exact same immovable wall.
The physical office was suddenly outlawed.
Exactly. The direct path, putting human beings in a room to collaborate synchronously, was literally illegal.
And the initial reaction for the vast majority of companies was to try and force the straight line anyway. I remember it. They couldn't be in the physical office, so they tried to forcefully map the exact mechanics of a 1990s cubicle farm onto a digital interface.
Oh, it was awful. Endless, grueling, back-to-back synchronous video calls. Managers demanding those green active bubbles on chat apps to simulate looking over people's shoulders. Rigid 9 to 5 hours.
They fought the constraint.
Yeah.
And it resulted in historic levels of global burnout.
Because they treated the disaster as a temporary pause on the straight line, just waiting to go back to normal. Contrast that with companies that utilize the roundabout path, like Automatic and GitLab.
What did they do differently?
They looked at the absolute loss of the physical office and asked a very different question. They asked, how do we restructure our operational physics to make this constraint our primary advantage?
If you can't be in the same room, how do you optimize for absence?
Yes, you eradicate the synchronous meeting. If people aren't sharing physical space, there is zero logical reason they need to be sharing the exact same slice of time.
That makes total sense.
So these companies leaned heavily into asynchronous architecture. They implemented a ruthless documentation-first culture. Every operational decision, every project update, every strategic pivot is written down in a central, universally accessible handbook.
The mechanics of that are brilliant. It means a lead developer waking up in Tokyo can read the exact, nuanced thought process of a product manager who logged off 6 hours earlier in Seattle.
Exactly. They never have to speak, they never have to schedule a call, and the project never stops moving.
By weaponizing the constraint of physical separation, they unlocked continuous 24-hour global development cycles.
They didn't just survive the loss of the office. They used the disaster to access an elite, borderless talent pool that their office-bound competitors couldn't touch. They bypassed the friction of commuting, office politics, and synchronous bottlenecks.
The disaster became the exact mechanism that allowed them to scale at a fraction of the traditional cost.
Exactly right.
Man, this entire deep dive completely fractures the conventional wisdom of success. The straightest line to your objective is almost always the most heavily defended, friction-heavy route available. It telegraphs your moves and invites gatekeepers to block your progress.
Finding the sideways entrance isn't a distraction, it's a strategic necessity.
Furthermore, when you inevitably hit a wall or face a massive failure, that disaster is not the end of the narrative. The wreckage is the raw data you need to identify the correct path.
It requires immense psychological discipline to view your own failures as objective data, but it is the defining characteristic of enduring success. Let's center on the language one last time just to really lock it in.
Let's do it.
Notice how the syllables force you to slow down and consider the balance of the action. Ikuewezi, ikuanweli. The winding path becomes the direct route. Adversity becomes the advantage.
As we wrap up this analysis, step away from the tech startups and the hedge funds for a moment and look at your own immediate landscape. Think about the most frustrating, immovable roadblock currently sitting in your way.
We all have one.
The bottleneck you keep violently throwing yourself against, hoping it will break. What if that specific roadblock isn't actually preventing you from reaching your destination?
What if the filter?
Exactly. What if that wall is the exact filter required to force you off a saturated, predictable path and onto a vastly superior trajectory you never would have seen otherwise? What if the disaster in front of you is just the raw material for your greatest advantage?
Hope you loved today's 8-minute upgrade. Don't forget to subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.